Hello, and welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology 1. We're still on the introduction to anatomy and physiology, and we're in the structural design of living things. We've talked about cells, tissues, organs. I've defined organ systems. Now, among the 11 organ systems, I said I would only go into detail on 2 of them. We've already covered the cardiovascular system. So you've gotten the detail there, and now we're going to pick up with that, with talking about the organ systems, moving into the second system that I'm going to cover in any detail, pardon me, which is the lymphatic system. Now, in order to understand the lymphatic system, we just finished the cardiovascular system. Arteries led to arterioles, which lead to capillaries, which lead to venules, and then veins. So if I expand the picture a little bit, which is not easy for me to do, but I'll try. It's not a really perfect picture, but it's going to have to do. The point is to show you that the vessels aren't lines, they're tubes. The blood vessels are obviously tubes. So all I've done as I went from here to here is to magnify the picture so that you could see its tubes: artery, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins. The green are the tubes, the microscopically thin capillaries where exchange takes place. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take one of these capillary tubes, one of these microscopically thin capillary tubes, and I'm going to magnify it. Well, first let's label it. We'll label it as a capillary. It's a tube. And I drew the wall of the capillary as dashed lines instead of solid lines to indicate that it's a pore. The capillary has a porous wall, meaning pores, which are small holes. Now the capillaries in an organ, and by definition an organ is a structure composed of more than one type of tissue, and a tissue is made out of cells. So we can draw a cell, a few cells, just put a few cells around the capillary to remind us that the capillary is in an organ. Now, like any other blood vessel, the capillary has got blood flowing through it. And blood is a suspension, which is a kind of a mixture of a liquid and often something solid. In this case, the blood cells could be thought of as solid particles, or if you mixed sand with water, the sand would not dissolve in the water. You'd have particles of sand floating around. That's called a suspension. So the blood is a suspension of cells suspended in water. Now the water has materials dissolved in it. When you have materials dissolved in water, you call it a solution. So the blood is both a suspension with cells suspended in water and salts and nutrients and blood gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide dissolved in the water. That part is a solution, and that liquid part, if we just think of the blood as a liquid with cells suspended in the liquid part is called plasma. Now, if you didn't quite keep up with the discussion of solution and suspension, you can, at some point, you should go over that. I'm not going to make a big deal out of it on the test, but it would be helpful if you understood it. For now, let's just say blood has cells and liquid. If we want to focus on the liquid part of blood, we use the word plasma. So plasma is the liquid part of the blood. And the blood is being pumped through the blood vessels. So you can think of the blood as flowing through the blood vessels, or you could think of the plasma as flowing through the blood vessels. Either way would be correct. Now, whenever you have a fluid moving through a tube, so the blood moving through the blood vessels is a fluid moving through a tube. Whenever you have a fluid moving through a tube, the fluid or the liquid pushes out against the walls of the tube. It could be water flowing through a garden hose. Whatever it happens to be, the fluid will push out against the walls of the tube. So if you had a garden hose and you took a needle and you made a hole in the wall of the garden hose, water would squirt out through the hole. Why does water squirt out through the hole? Because the water is pushing out against the wall of the hose as it moves through the hose. Now, generally speaking, when you have a liquid or a fluid moving through a tube, the force of the liquid pressing out against the walls of the tube, in general, could be called hydrostatic pressure, hydro meaning water. And once I start teaching at the beginning of the semester, all the mucus that has been collecting in my lungs for the last 3 months, I know this is a lovely image, but the mucus just starts clearing out of my lungs. So I will be coughing at least until the beginning of November. You'll get used to it after a while. Anyway, in the case of the blood, the blood's moving through a tube. Being a fluid moving through a tube, the blood pushes out. I may have cut myself short before. In general, we call it hydrostatic pressure. In the case of the blood pushing out against the walls of the blood vessels, we call it blood pressure. In fact, the full term is blood hydrostatic pressure, but typically we just call it blood pressure. Blood is a fluid, it's moving through tubes. The tubes are called blood vessels. As the blood flows through the blood vessels, it pushes out against the wall of the tube. You call that blood pressure. But the capillaries have porous walls. So when the blood is pushing out against the walls of the tube, fluid leaks out. Now, this is a normal process. It might sound a little scary, but it's a normal process. The fluid's leaking out. Now, once the fluid leaves the blood vessel, it collects, the fluid collects, you could say around the cells or between the cells. So the cells end up being bathed in fluid. Were able to see me drinking the tea. Anyway, the cells end up being bathed in fluid. And that fluid is called tissue fluid. So while it's in the blood vessels, it could be an artery, a vein, a venule, whatever, the fluid's called plasma. So it's not only called plasma when it's in the capillaries, the liquid part of blood is called plasma, whatever type of vessel it's found in. It's pushing out against the wall of the capillary. The wall of the capillary is porous, so the fluid leaks out. It collects around the cells, and then we could call it tissue fluid, or some of you may already know it could also be called interstitial fluid. If you don't know that, don't concern yourself with it right now. We'll just call it tissue fluid. Now, it turns out that over any 24-hour period, a volume of fluid leaks out of the capillaries, because you've got capillaries all over your body, and all over your body, constantly, there's a small amount of fluid leaking out of the capillaries, and it adds up to about 3 quarts or 3 liters, if you want to use the metric system. Roughly 3 liters of fluid leaks out of the capillaries. The story's a little more complicated than that, and when you take anatomy and physiology too, you'll learn a little more detail to it. I'm trying to keep it simple, so I'm just saying a volume of fluid leaks out every 24 hours, which is roughly 3 quarts of fluid, which is an interesting number because that's all of the plasma you have. You've got about 5 liters of blood, and roughly half, a little more than half of it is plasma. So a little more than half of your blood is plasma, a little less than half are blood cells. And every 24 hours, an amount of liquid leaks out of your capillaries that is equal to the total amount of plasma that you have, the total amount of liquid that you have in the bloodstream. Well, obviously something else must be going on because you couldn't survive without any plasma. So, what else is going on is that wherever you have blood capillaries, wherever in your body you have blood capillaries, which is pretty much all over the body, there will be a second set of tubing. And you should look at pictures of the lymphatic system, but you should use your textbook. You can go online and find pictures, because this is not what it looks like. This is just a representation of what's going on. Wherever you have blood capillaries, you'll have tubes alongside of the blood capillary, which I'm going to call lymphatic vessels. So wherever you have blood capillaries, alongside of the blood capillaries, you have these vessels or tubes. I'm calling them lymphatic vessels. Now there's a few different types of lymphatic vessels, and they have different names. At this point, they'd actually be called lymphatic capillaries, but I'm trying to avoid most of the detail. So we'll just call these lymphatic vessels. And again, we have a problem. The problem is every 24 hours, a volume of fluid leaks out of your bloodstream equal to the total amount of plasma. So it leaks out of the blood, it surrounds the cells, and then it leaks into these lymphatic vessels. The same fluid ends up leaking into the lymphatic vessels. Now once that fluid has entered the lymphatic tubing, the lymphatic vessels is called lymph. L-Y-M-P-H. Lymph. So when it's in the blood vessels, it's called plasma. When the liquid is around the cells, it's called tissue fluid. Once the fluid or liquid enters the lymphatic vessels, it's called lymph, L-Y-M-P-H. Now, to the extent that I just described what's going on here, and what am I in the middle of talking about? I'm in the middle of talking about the lymphatic system. These tubes are a very large part of the lymphatic system. The lymphatic vessels form a large part of the lymphatic system. Now there's other parts, the tonsils, the spleen, other parts of the lymphatic system. We're not getting into it, I'm just indicating these tubes for now. And I described the fluid, plasma, tissue fluid, lymph. To the extent that I've described the fluid, what is the difference between plasma, tissue fluid, and lymph? And the answer can be given in one word. So take a moment, you might want to pause the video. In one word, to the extent that I've just described things, what is the difference between plasma, tissue fluid, and lymph? And if you came up with the word location, then you've come up with the correct answer. I'm not going to write location on the board. I almost wrote it on the board, but I just don't feel like it. So, to the extent that I've described plasma, tissue fluid, and lymph, what's the difference? The location. When it's located in the blood vessels, it's called plasma. When the fluid is located around the cells, it's called tissue fluid. When it's located in the lymphatic vessels, it's called lymph. Now, I began to describe the lymphatic system after elaborating or describing a problem. And the problem is that every 24 hours, a volume of liquid leaks out of your bloodstream, out of your capillaries, equal to the total amount of plasma. That's a problem. And now I'm telling you that the lymphatic system, in particular the lymphatic vessels, are there to solve the problem. Now, if the lymphatic vessels are supposed to be solving the problem, where would they have to carry the lymph? All of the fluids leaking out of the blood, that's a problem. The lymph vessels, the lymphatic vessels are solving the problem. So where do they have to be carrying the lymph? And take a minute and think about that. Well, they have to be carrying the lymph back to the bloodstream. Now, when I go over this in an actual physical classroom with actual students, I ask the question, where would the tubes have to be carrying the liquid? And people will often say things like capillaries or the heart, which is sort of the correct idea. They're seeing that the liquid has to go back into the cardiovascular system. But I haven't said where these tubes connect back into the cardiovascular system. Now you may know that. You may have known that before you got here. But I didn't tell you where those lymphatic vessels connect back into the cardiovascular system. So you wouldn't know that answer based on what I've told you so far. So when I ask the question, where do these lymphatic vessels have to go? If you're understanding the discussion, then you'll realize they must be going back to the bloodstream and returning the fluid, which here is called lymph, is going to flow back into the blood vessels. And as soon as it gets back into the blood vessels, it's going to be called plasma again. Now, if you're curious, all of the lymphatic vessels, those that come down from the skull, those that come up, come in from your arms, there's vessels below your collarbones. Collarbones are called clavicles. They're veins, they're below the clavicles. The prefix that means below is sub, so they're called subclavian veins. And all of the lymphatic vessels empty into, ultimately, the left and right subclavian vein. So that's specifically how the fluid gets back into the bloodstream. Don't concern yourself with subclavian veins for now, although at this point it would probably be hard for you to forget that we're calling them subclavian veins. So to summarize what we've got so far, I've already described the cardiovascular system. It's got a pump called the heart. It's got 5 kinds of blood vessels, and it's got the blood. As the blood flows through capillaries, fluid leaks out. The lymphatic system returns that fluid back to the bloodstream. Now, it's as if nature has said, I've got this lymph flowing back through the lymphatic vessels, flowing back to the bloodstream. I'm going to take this as an opportunity to clean up the lymph. Now, the scale here is, the size scale is incorrect. These would be microscopic tubes. The cells are microscopic. These structures would be a little bit larger than microscopic, maybe a 1/4 inch or so in diameter. So the scale is off. Now, all of you know the names of these structures. You might just not realize that that name is referring to these structures. So what are these structures? These structures are called lymph nodes. So as the lymph is flowing through the lymphatic vessels back to the bloodstream, it goes through the lymph nodes, and there's special tissue in the lymph nodes, and there are certain types of cells. I'm not going to get into the detail, but the lymph node cleans up the lymph as the lymph is going back to the blood. So the lymph may contain debris of dead cells from your own body. The lymph might contain bacterial cells. It might contain cancer cells. And as the lymph flows back to the bloodstream, it goes through these lymph nodes, which are found in clusters throughout your body, and they clean up the lymph. So to this point, what do you know about the lymph system? You know that it's made out of at least lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes, and again, there's other structures as well that you'll learn about when you take Anatomy and Physiology 2. Okay, so that is as much as I'm going to say about the organ systems. I've described 2 out of the 11 organ systems in some detail. Those are the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic system. 2, we've just finished the organ systems, and the next level of the structural design is the organism. Now, the organism is whole. It's the whole thing. Everything I've talked about prior to the organism has been a part. Cells are parts of your body, or tissues are parts of your body, organs are parts of your body. Even an organ system can be considered a part of your body. But when we get to the level of the organism, we're talking about the whole body. And because it's whole, it can do something the parts cannot do, which is it can live on its own. So that gives us the definition for organism: an independent living thing. notice that the quality of this definition is different than the preceding definitions for the other levels, which, except for the cellular level, the other levels, tissue, organ, and organ system, were all defined by what makes them up. A tissue was defined as being made up of cells. An organ was defined as being a structure made up of more than one type of tissue. An organ system is made up of a collection of organs. We are not defining organism as a collection of organ systems. So again, the quality or the sense of this definition is different than the previous terms. Here, we're not defining it as a group of organ systems, rather we're defining it as an independent living thing. And what makes it have the ability to live more or less on its own, to be more or less independent, is the fact that it's the whole thing and everything else is a part. The parts can't live on their own. If you were standing online at the bank and there was a liver standing behind you, you'd probably think, I really got to close my account here and find another bank. I'm not comfortable with the livers standing behind me. So the organism, the whole thing. Now that's really pretty much what I wanted to say about the structural design of living things, but it's my nature always to go a few steps too far. And so I just want to point out there's two very broad categories of organisms, which are unicellular organisms, which in second grade would have been called single-celled living things. So if you remember the phrase single-celled living things, that translates into unicellular organism. Uni means one, single, celled, and what's an organism? It's a living thing. So there's two broad categories of organisms, and bacteria would be unicellular, certain fungi, plural for fungus, mushrooms are not unicellular, but certain mushrooms are fungi. They don't happen to be unicellular. Certain algae, and the list goes on and on and on. There's far more kinds of unicellular organisms than there are of the other type, which would be multicellular organisms. Meaning many-celled living things. Multi is many. Many-celled living things. Humans, cats, dogs, maple trees, and the list goes on. But again, there's far more unicellular organisms, different kinds of unicellular organisms, than there are kinds of multicellular organisms. Now, both categories are considered to be organisms because they're the whole thing. A single bacterial cell is a whole bacterium. A single algal cell, one cell of algae, if it's a kind of algae that's unicellular, one cell would be the whole thing. And being the whole thing, it could live independently. So both categories are organisms, and it's because the definition for organism is an independent living thing. Now, just for the sake of testing your understanding, I say, and it's true, the definition for organism is an independent living thing. But what if the definition were a group of organ systems that work together? If that were the definition, it isn't. But if that an organism is a group of organ systems that work together, if that were the definition of an organism, then one of these two categories could not be considered to be an organism. It might exist, the creature might exist, but it wouldn't be considered an organism if the definition for organism were a group of organ systems that work together. Now, to test your understanding of this discussion, pause the video if you need to and answer the question, which of these two categories of organisms could not meet the definition of organism if the definition of organism was a group of organ systems that work together? And the answer is, this group, it could still exist. There still could be bacteria, fungi, algae, and all of the, I'm going to guess, millions of other single-celled living things. But they would not be considered organisms if the definition for organism was a group of organ systems that work together. Now, if you understand why this couldn't meet that definition, a group of organ systems that work together, it means you basically understand the whole structural design as I've described it. And the reason is, I hope it's obvious, if it's one single cell, like a bacterial cell, it can't form tissues because a tissue is made of more than one cell. It's a group of cells. It couldn't form organs because organs are made out of more than one type of tissue. If it can't form organs, it can't form organ systems. And if it can't form organ systems, it can't be a group of organ systems. So if the definition for organism were a group of organ systems that work together, then the only kind of organism that there would be multicellular organisms. There still could be bacteria and all the rest of these things. They just wouldn't be called organisms. But that's not the definition for organism. That definition is an independent living thing, the whole thing. So we do have two broad categories of organisms, which are unicellular and multicellular. And that brings us to homeostasis. And homeostasis has more to do with function. So where I called Roman number 2 the structural design of living things, we get now to Roman number 3, homeostasis. And we can think of that as a functional design of living things. And we'll pick up with that in the next video. I'm going to take a break, which I so richly deserve.